Alright kids, by popular request from one of my old professors of all things, we're doing another long-delayed installment in our ongoing series in which we take a look at original exploitative horror films from the 1970s and 1980s and compare them to their updated remakes from the 2000s and the 2010s. And today we have an especially awesome candidate here. We have I Spit on Your Grave, the 1978 exploitation classic rated by Miyazaki, and comparing it to the 2010 remake, which was produced by Miyazaki but directed by a guy named Stephen Monroe, and more on both of these gentlemen later on. Okay, so I Spit on Your Grave, the original, is one of the all-time masterpieces of drive-in cinema. It was a film that was picketed and protested, and to this day it's considered one of the few degenerate cinema classics of the old guard. I'd say it's up there with Salo and Cannibal Holocaust as being the truly timeless extreme B movies that still have a palatable impact on audience viewers the world over. And of course, it's a controversial film because it deals with rape, which is never a fun subject to explore. And I think most people, even if they haven't actually encountered the film themselves, they have sort of a preconceived notion about the contents of the film. Notoriously, Roger Ebert had that scathing review where he gave it 0 stars and basically criticized everyone who went to go see it, calling them a bunch of savages and hypocrites, and he just condemned all of Western society for the film existing. But actually, I'm going to take the antithetical route. I think that not only is the original I Spit on Your Grave a genuinely great exploitative B movie, I think it's actually a fantastic film in its own right, and I think actually a film that in some ways almost takes a feminist approach to an issue which up until then I think had been mainly painted through a male lens. But more on that later. So first off, let's compare the script. The original script was written by Miyazaki, the guy that also directed it. The remake, I think, has an all-new screenplay, but is produced by Miyazaki. The thing is, they're very similar. It has the exact same premise, more or less. You have a woman who is an author named Jennifer Hills. In the original film, she was played by Camille Keaton, and in the sequel, she was played by... Okay, hold on one second. Let me have to Wikipedia this one. Played by Sarah Butler. So there you go. Pretty much playing the same character, same storyline. She's from New York and she heads to the mountains to work on an article or a book or something. And while she's there, she's confronted by a bunch of really, really aggressive locals who then decide to do horrible, unspeakable things to her. And it really is sort of the final stamp on the whole rape horror genre, subgenre, categorization. Because I don't think any film before or since has really done it as effectively and impactfully as the original. As far as script goes, like I said before, they're very, very similar. The only thing is, I think with the pseudo remake that was made in 2010, they do kind of change up the characters. They change the villains up and make one of them a sheriff. And it is a little bit more cartoonish. It kind of follows a more action movie-ish plot, I guess. The characters just aren't as relatable. They don't seem as real. In fact, the entire remake kind of has sort of this phantasmagoric quality, which I think doesn't make it as realistic and effective as the original. So in terms of script, even though they are very much similar in nature, I'm going to have to go with the original I Spit on Your Grave. We're going to be very cute. Instead of giving them check marks, we're going to give them tombstones. So there you go. That's one victory for the original. Now as far as direction goes, okay, the script for these two movies are very similar, so I think this would clearly demonstrate the directorial abilities of both men. And this one, once again, I think is a blowout. I think Miyazaki definitely did a better job with the material than Stephen Monroe, who is a guy who has made a lot of substandard sci-fi quality garbage movies like It Waits over the last couple of years. If you haven't seen that one, don't waste your time. Really, Zarchi, his direction is just fantastic. You go in there and it feels downright brutal and you're in the thick of things, and it almost at times takes on this really weird, almost sort of a documentary vibe going on, which is something you don't get with I Spit on Your Grave, which feels way too glossy and plastic, and really the production values on the remake I think are way too high. For a film like I Spit on Your Grave, you really got to go for that gritty quality. I think it makes it all the more impactful. And as far as direction, it's just better. I like all of the sort of executive choices Zarchi made. For example, one of the things I think is really great is, you go back and you watch I Spit on Your Grave, and there's this really sort of like horrific drone to it. And that's because there's no music. That was his call. They don't have any soundtrack, so the entire time you're just kind of caught up there with like this ambiance. You hear crickets and white noise, and I think that makes it all the more eerie and realistic, and kind of takes you out of the whole movie watching element. Whereas I think with the remake, you have the score and it's very muted, and they're really trying way too hard to make it sound dramatic and underscored. And I think that really does take you out of the experience altogether. So direction, I'm going to have to go once again. Another victory for the original I Spit on Your Grave. Another little tombstone. Acting. Once again, I'm going to go with the original. I think this is one of the bigger differences between the two movies. I think with I Spit on Your Grave, the original, you kind of get the idea that as bad as the antagonists in the film are, there's still a bit of humanity. Like, even though they did something absolutely unspeakably, unforgivably horrible to the protagonists of the film, you kind of get this idea that maybe up until then they'd been kind of decent guys. Like, maybe it's the first time they've ever done anything like that. They just got totally carried away and got swept up in a crime, and they feel some granules of remorse. There's a little bit of humanity there, where there's a great scene where they're all sitting around at a diner, and they're just not saying anything, and they have these looks in their eyes like they've just done something absolutely unspeakably horrific and unforgivable and atrocious. And there's some humanity there. It makes it nuanced. And I think, of course, Camille Keaton does a way better job than the other actress in the update. So anyway, the acting and the follow-up, once again, it's too cartoony. The guys really don't have much in the way of humanity. They're all very one-dimensional. They don't really regret what they do. There's a character in the remake who's patterned after a sheriff who's just completely over the top and sort of a stereotype, and I think really kind of makes the film nowhere near as impactful or realistic or as gripping as the original. So what do you know? The original, I Spit on Your Grave, also wins this round. Special effects. Okay, you would think that even though there were about a 30-year difference between the films, that the remake would have the better overall effects, but you know what? I'm actually going to give this one to the original as well. When you watch I Spit on Your Grave, it really comes off like your standard Gorno film. There's some really over-the-top death scenes in that one. There's a guy who has his eyelids propped open with fish hooks and birds peck out his face. There's another guy who gets like dropped in chemical cleaner. I mean, it's really sort of, I don't know, it's just a little bit too much for me. It just seems too far-fetched, way too Saw-like, way too Hostel-like. Whereas I think with the original, I mean, it's really over the top too, but at least it's believable. And in fact, you watch the original film, it has one of the absolute most heinous scenes ever in the history of motion picture. Well, actually, there's quite a few of them, but the one in the picture I'm talking about is the part where the guy's in the bathtub, and the butcher knife comes into play, and he ends up losing his membership to a very privileged club, if you get my drift, and I hope you don't. Well, anyway, if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about, and it's never left your memory, and you're scarred for life. So there you go. Once again, victory goes to the original. I'm noticing a recurring theme here when I'm reviewing these films and comparing them. It seems as if the original always wins, and not just always wins, but wins in every category. That's probably telling about modern filmmaking as a whole. And overall, just look right at the tally we have already. This is just not even a fair fight. I think I Spit on Your Grave is actually an underrated classic that actually did something very innovative. It still has an impact today. It was very, I think, sort of pioneering, because when you look at rape revenge films prior to I Spit on Your Grave, they really weren't pro-feminist. Even something like Last House on the Left or The Virgin Spring. I mean, who were the guys that took action? It wasn't the victims themselves, it was their parents. It was some male figurehead. And in this one, you actually have Jennifer Hill becoming the redeeming angel, the angel of vengeance, going after her wrongdoers. And I think, contrary to what Roger Ebert, some of the press said, this is a film that does not trivialize rape. This is a film that I think actually had sort of the foresight and the audaciousness, really, to kind of depict rape as the horrible crime that it is. I mean, when you watch that film, you're not thinking, oh, wow, that looks entertaining. You're thinking, oh, goodness, that's just atrocious. That's horrible. How can anyone do this to another human being? Whereas I think in films prior and even films afterwards, I think those are the films that kind of try to sort of downplay it. They don't make it look like a crime. I think a good example of that is Revenge of the Nerds. I mean, that's a film with a blatant rape scene, which is actually played for comedy. So there you go. What's really offensive? Which one is sort of pandering and promoting the much ballyhooed rape culture? A film like I Spit on Your Grave, which goes in there and shows the absolute horrificness of the crime as a whole, or all those teen tech comedies from the era, which totally use it as a plot point for humor. Well, yeah, like I said, kind of a moot point. So yeah, Spit on Your Grave, it's really effective, it's chilling, the effects are amazing, the acting is not great, but it doesn't have to be because the story is so strong. This is one of those movies where, when you watch films, you're not watching it for great acting, you're watching it for sheer impact and sheer brutality and just sheer the experientialism of it all. And I think Last Spit on Your Grave, you're getting a much more entertaining, a much more thought-provoking, and honestly a much more exhausting experience than what you get with the remake, which honestly is really substandard and boring and a pale imitation of the original, and just your random post-Eli Roth, Rob Zombie, straight-to-video bore fest. So what do you know? The original wins again. So my final advice for you, you should probably skip the remake because there's really not much in there that the original doesn't already convey, and a million times better. So there you go. I Spit on Your Grave. Go with the original. 2010, not happening.